The year was 1945. Spring had arrived, but Europe still smoldered beneath a blanket of ash and ruin. From Berlin to Brussels, cities lay broken, their streets littered with rubble and grief. Across the Atlantic Ocean, however, America stood untouched by bombers, its skyline gleaming, its factories humming with the rhythm of victory. Yet even in this land of promise and plenty, the air hung thick with tension. The war was ending, but its wounds were raw, its memories sharp as broken glass. It was in this fragile moment that news broke of an event so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it sent shockwaves through every town and city from Maine to California. A group of female German prisoners of war, women who had once worn the uniform of the enemy, who had stood on the opposite side of history's greatest conflict, were to be brought to New York City, not as prisoners in chains, not locked in the back of military trucks, but as visitors. They would walk the streets of Manhattan like ordinary tourists. They would see the Empire State Building, taste American food, breathe the free air of Fifth Avenue. The announcement ignited a firestorm. In living rooms across America, families who had sent their sons to die on distant battlefields felt their blood boil. How dare the government allow enemy combatants to stroll through American streets while those very streets still mourned their dead? In newspaper offices, editors scrambled to capture the public rage, the confusion, the bitter sense of betrayal. Radio hosts demanded answers. Congressmen received angry letters by the thousands. The question burned on everyone's lips. Why? But behind this controversial decision lay something far more complex than simple charity or reckless generosity. This was an experiment, a calculated gamble in the great game of nations. The United States government, victorious but wary of the fragile peace to come, sought to prove something to the world. They wanted to demonstrate that American democracy was not just a military force but a moral one, that American justice extended even to enemies, that the values inscribed on the Statue of Liberty were not hollow words but living principles. For the German women at the center of this storm, the journey represented something entirely different. They knew nothing of political strategy or diplomatic messaging. They knew only that their world had collapsed, that everything they had been told to believe had crumbled to dust, and that now they were being offered a glimpse into the nation they had been taught to hate. For them, this trip was not about politics. It was about survival, about identity, about confronting the terrible question that haunted their every waking moment. Who were they now that everything they had known was gone? In a military facility 2 hours outside New York City, Colonel Robert Harrison stood before a classified briefing document, his jaw tight with disapproval. At 53, Harrison was a career officer who had seen combat in the First War and commanded prisoner operations in this one. He believed in rules, in order, in the clear line between victory and defeat. This program violated every instinct he possessed. His aide, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-minded woman of 28 who had worked her way up through military intelligence, watched him with knowing eyes. She understood his resistance, but she also understood something he did not. The world was changing, and rigid thinking would not survive what came next. Down the hall, in a sparse holding room, 5 German women waited in uneasy silence. Greta Werner, 31, had been a communications officer, her face still bearing the stern discipline of military service. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded, her expression revealing nothing. Beside her, Marguerite Klein, 24, fidgeted with a loose thread on her prison-issued dress. Margaretha had been conscripted as a logistics clerk, had never fired a weapon, had spent the war pushing papers in an office far from any front line. Her eyes held a perpetual wetness, as though tears were always waiting just beneath the surface. Across from them sat Helene Fischer, 36, the oldest of the group, a former nurse who had tended wounded soldiers until the final chaotic days when the armies collapsed and everyone became prisoners or refugees. Helene's face bore deep lines of exhaustion, but her hands remained steady, the hands of someone trained to function through catastrophe. Elizabeth Schaefer, 27, possessed a quiet, watchful intelligence. She had been a teacher before the war, dragged into auxiliary service as the Reich grew desperate. Now she observed everything, cataloging each detail as though preparing for a test she did not yet understand. The youngest among them was Anna Becker, barely 20 years old. With blonde hair she had long since stopped trying to keep neat, and eyes that seemed perpetually startled, as though the entire world had become foreign to her. Anna had been a farm girl from Bavaria, swept up in the final desperate recruitment drives, given a uniform and a meaningless assignment at a supply depot that fell to American forces within days. She understood the least about what was happening to them, but perhaps for that reason, she felt it most keenly. On the other side of the equation, America waited. In a cramped newspaper office in downtown Manhattan, Jack Morrison, a reporter for the New York Herald, chained smoked cigarettes while arguing with his editor about the assignment. At 33, Jack had covered labor strikes, political corruption, and mob violence. He had a nose for stories that mattered. This one smelled wrong to him, too staged, too calculated. But his editor insisted. This was the story of the month, maybe the year. The public had to know what was happening, had to see these enemy women with their own eyes, filtered through Jack's prose. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Queens, Thomas Reed sat in darkness, a bottle of whiskey on the table before him, his Distinguished Service Cross gathering dust on the mantel. Thomas had returned from Europe 3 months ago, his body intact, but his mind shattered by what he had seen at Bastogne, at the Rhine, in the smoking remains of German villages where children stared at him with hollow eyes. He had killed enemy soldiers. He had watched his friends die. And now the radio told him that enemy prisoners would be walking free in his city, eating American food, enjoying American hospitality. The injustice of it burned in his chest like swallowed acid. The decision had come from the highest levels, approved by officials who believed that mercy could be a weapon, that demonstrating American values would win the peace more surely than any bomb. The director of the War Department's prisoner rehabilitation program, a thin, intellectual man named Dr. Charles Whitmore, had argued passionately for the initiative. Show them what they fought against, he insisted. Show them the prosperity, the freedom, the kindness of American society. Transform them from enemies into witnesses. Someday, these women would return to Germany and tell others what they had seen. They would become ambassadors of American ideals, living proof that democracy offered something better than totalitarianism. Not everyone was convinced. Senator William Bradford, a hawk from Pennsylvania who had lost a nephew at Normandy, denounced the program on the Senate floor. He called it a disgrace, an insult to every family who had sacrificed for the war effort. His voice thundered through the chamber. While American boys still fight and die in the Pacific, we parade their enemies through our streets like honored guests. This is not mercy. This is madness. The newspapers picked up the story with savage glee. Some editorial boards praised the humanitarian gesture, calling it evidence of American moral superiority. Others condemned it as weak-kneed liberalism, a betrayal of the men and women in uniform. Political cartoonists had a field day, drawing caricatures of German prisoners dining in fancy restaurants, while wounded veterans begged for scraps. The nation found itself divided, not by military strategy or political philosophy, but by a fundamental question about the nature of justice and revenge. Through all this controversy, the 5 women at the center of the storm understood only fragments. They were told they would take a trip. They were told to behave appropriately, to follow instructions, to represent themselves with dignity. But no one explained why. No one told them they had become pawns in a larger game, symbols in a debate about the soul of the nation that had defeated them. They knew only that their world had already ended once. And now something strange and inexplicable was beginning. The morning of departure arrived cold and gray. A military bus waited outside the facility, its engine idling, exhaust rising in white plumes against the pale sky. Colonel Harrison stood at attention as the 5 women filed out, their expressions ranging from Greta's stony defiance to Anna's barely concealed terror. Lieutenant Mitchell walked beside them, her role undefined, somewhere between guard and guide. She carried a clipboard and a service pistol, but her voice when she spoke was neutral, almost gentle. "You'll be traveling by train," she explained. "The journey takes approximately 2 hours. You'll be accompanied by military personnel and members of the press. You are expected to conduct yourselves appropriately at all times." Greta wanted to spit at the word appropriately, wanted to ask what appropriateness meant when your entire nation had been destroyed, when everything you believed had been revealed as lies, when you were neither prisoner nor free but something undefined and uncomfortable in between. But she said nothing. Silence had become her fortress. The bus rolled through the countryside, passing farms where Americans worked fields that had never seen battle, where children played in yards uncratered by shells. Margaret pressed her face to the window, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Her village in Saxony was gone, literally erased from the map by bombing raids. Her family's fate remained unknown. And here was America, untouched, abundant, impossibly whole. The train station bustled with ordinary life. Businessmen hurried past clutching briefcases. Mothers herded children toward platforms. Vendors sold newspapers and coffee and fresh pastries. The 5 women stood in their government-issued dresses, clearly marked as outsiders, as the curious and the hostile began to take notice. A businessman in a gray suit stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening as he recognized what they must be. "Germans," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "German prisoners walking around free. What the hell is this country coming to?" Jack Morrison waited on the platform, notebook already in hand, studying the women with a journalist's calculating gaze. He had expected hardened soldiers, Nazi fanatics with cruel eyes and propaganda slogans ready on their lips. Instead, he saw 5 exhausted women who looked like they had been beaten by fate and were still trying to understand how they had survived. The youngest one, the blonde girl, looked like she might faint. The oldest one, the one with the gray-streaked hair, had the steady presence of someone who had seen too much death to be shocked by anything anymore. This was not the story he had expected to write. Lieutenant Mitchell ushered them onto the train, into a reserved compartment that offered some privacy, but not enough to prevent curious passengers from pressing their faces against the glass, staring like the women were zoo animals. An elderly woman tapped on the window and mouthed something that looked like "shame on you." A teenage boy gave them a mock salute and laughed. Elizabeth turned away from the window, unable to bear the scrutiny, and found herself meeting Jack Morrison's eyes. He had followed them into the compartment, uninvited but apparently expected. His expression was complicated, neither friendly nor hostile, just deeply, unsettlingly curious. "Do any of you speak English?" Jack asked, his pen poised above his notepad. Helene answered, her accent thick but her words clear. "Some. A little. Enough." "Why do you think you're here?" Jack pressed. "Do they tell you why they're bringing you to New York?" Helene considered the question carefully. "They tell us nothing. We know nothing. We are here because we are told to be here. This is what prisoners do. They follow orders. But you're not being treated like prisoners," Jack observed. "You're being given a tour, like guests." Greta laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Guests? We are trophies. We are something to be shown, to prove a point. We do not know what point. We only know we are being used." Her English was better than she had let on, sharpened by education, and a mind too intelligent to be dulled by defeat. The train lurched forward, beginning its journey south toward the city. Outside the window, America rolled past, green and prosperous and alien. The women fell into silence, each lost in private thoughts. Anna closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, but the memory had begun to fade, replaced by harder images. The supply depot burning, American soldiers shouting orders she didn't understand, the chaos of surrender. She had wet herself in fear that day, standing with her hands raised, certain she would be shot. Instead, she had been processed, documented, transported to a facility where she was fed regularly, and given clean water, and treated with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency that was somehow more disorienting than cruelty would have been. Also in the train car, though seated several rows away, was Thomas Reed. He had not planned to be here. He had been visiting his sister in Connecticut when he heard about the prisoner transport, heard the rumors flying through the veteran community that enemy POWs would be traveling this very route. Something dark and hungry had driven him to buy a ticket, to board this train, to see for himself if the rumors were true. Now he sat rigid in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes locked on the compartment where the German women's Saturday rage and something else, something more complicated, battled in his chest. The train carried them all forward, through stations and towns, past factories and churches, toward the glittering spire of Manhattan that rose in the distance like a monument to American confidence. As they approached the city, the buildings grew taller, the streets more crowded, the evidence of American prosperity more overwhelming. The women pressed against the windows despite themselves, unable to look away from the spectacle. They had been told America was decadent, weak, doomed to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. The propaganda had been thorough and relentless. But this was not weakness. This was power, raw and undeniable, expressed in steel and glass and electric lights that burned even in daylight. Grand Central Terminal engulfed them in noise and movement and scale that defied comprehension. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead like a cathedral to commerce and motion. Thousands of people rushed past in every direction, each pursuing private purposes, each moving with the confidence of citizens in a nation that had won. The 5 women stood frozen on the platform, overwhelmed, until Lieutenant Mitchell gently urged them forward. "Stay close," she instructed. "Stay together." But staying together proved difficult as a crowd began to form. Word had spread, carried by that mysterious telegraph of urban gossip, that enemy prisoners were here, in the station, walking among ordinary Americans. People began to gather, some curious, some outraged, all staring with an intensity that felt physical. A man in a business suit pushed forward, his face red with anger. "My brother died in France, killing your people," he shouted at Greta, who met his gaze with level calm. "You got no right to be here. No right at all." Jack Morrison scribbled furiously, capturing every word, every gesture, knowing this was the confrontation his editor wanted, the conflict that would sell newspapers. But as he wrote, he found himself feeling something unexpected. Pity. These women had not asked to be here. They had not requested this circus. They were being displayed like curiosities, their dignity stripped away in service of a political point he still didn't fully understand. Thomas Reed had followed them off the train, keeping his distance but unable to walk away. He watched the angry businessman confront the women, watched the crowd press closer, and felt his own rage beginning to crack, revealing something beneath it that might have been exhaustion or might have been the first faint stirring of doubt. These women did not look like the enemy he had fought. They looked like refugees, like survivors, like people who had lost everything and were still trying to figure out how to continue existing. Lieutenant Mitchell raised her voice, commanding without shouting. "Everyone step back. These women are under military custody. Clear the area." The crowd reluctantly obeyed, more from respect for her uniform than from any desire to comply. She herded the 5 women toward the exit, toward the waiting vehicles that would carry them through the city streets to begin their surreal tour of enemy territory. Outside the terminal, New York City assaulted their senses with its vitality. The streets roared with traffic, horns blaring in chaotic symphony. Pedestrians flowed past in rivers of purpose and urgency. Newsstands shouted headlines about victory and peace and the trials beginning in Nuremberg. Vendors sold hot dogs and pretzels from carts, the smell of cooking meat mingling with exhaust fumes and the spring-damp scent of the city itself. The women were loaded into an open-top bus, the kind used for tourist excursions, another calculated choice by whoever had designed this program. They would not be hidden, they would be seen. As the bus pulled into traffic, people on the sidewalks turned to stare. Some waved, confused about what they were witnessing. Others shouted insults or obscenities. One woman, her face twisted with grief and rage, hurled an apple that struck the side of the bus with a dull thud. Anna flinched violently at the impact, her hands flying up to protect her face even though the fruit was nowhere near her. Margarethe began to cry again, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. But amid the hostility, there were also moments of strange connection. An elderly man on a street corner lifted his hat to them, a gesture of old-world courtesy that transcended nationality. A group of children pointed and laughed, not with cruelty but with the simple curiosity of youth confronting something unusual. A woman in a fur coat, elegant and composed, simply looked at them with an expression of profound sadness, as though recognizing in their faces something universally human and universally tragic. The bus carried them down Fifth Avenue, past department stores whose windows displayed abundance that seemed almost obscene to women who had spent years under rationing and scarcity. Mannequins wore dresses of silk and satin. Jewelry glittered behind polished glass. Signs advertised sales and specials, the language of commercial prosperity that belonged to a world these women had been taught existed only as decadent fantasy. Greta found herself doing calculations in her head, comparing prices to what things had cost in Germany before the war, before the inflation, before everything collapsed. The numbers made no sense. This place operated by rules she had never learned. The bus stopped at a diner on 42nd Street, a deliberate choice to expose the women to ordinary American life. Lieutenant Mitchell led them inside, where the lunch crowd looked up from their meals with expressions ranging from shock to fascination to outright anger. The owner, a Greek immigrant named Nicholas Papadakis, who had built his business through decades of hard work, approached Mitchell with obvious discomfort. "I don't know about this, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "My nephew is still fighting in the Pacific. My customers, they might not understand." "They don't have to understand," Mitchell replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "They just have to accept it. These women are here under official orders. We'll take a booth in the back, we'll order, we'll leave. No trouble." Nicholas nodded reluctantly and led them to the most isolated booth he could find. The women slid into the vinyl seats, their movements awkward, uncertain how to behave in this aggressively normal space. A waitress approached, her expression carefully neutral, her order pad held like a shield. "What'll it be?" she asked, her Queen's accent thick as cream. Lieutenant Mitchell ordered for them 5 hamburgers, 5 Coca-Colas, 5 slices of apple pie. Basic American fare, the kind of meal 1,000 GIs had dreamed about while eating rations in foxholes. When the food arrived, steaming and generous, the women stared at it with something approaching disbelief. Anna picked up the hamburger with trembling hands, brought it to her mouth, took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Beef and cheese and pickles and mustard, flavors she had half forgotten existed. She began to cry while she chewed, unable to separate hunger from grief, from the overwhelming strangeness of eating enemy food in enemy territory, while being photographed by Jack Morrison, who had somehow gained entry and was documenting every moment. Helene drank the Coca-Cola slowly, letting the sweet carbonation wash over her tongue. She had heard about this drink, this symbol of American imperialism, and had been taught to despise it on principle. Now she found herself unable to deny that it was delicious, and hated herself a little for the admission. Margarethe couldn't eat at all. Her stomach twisted too tight with anxiety and sorrow. Elizabeth ate mechanically, fuel for a body she was no longer sure belonged to her. Greta ate with deliberate precision, refusing to show weakness, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her undone by a simple meal. At a table near the window, Thomas Reed sat alone with his own hamburger untouched before him. He had followed them here, unable to break away, compelled by something he couldn't name. He watched the blonde girl cry into her food and felt his carefully maintained anger begin to falter. He had spent months nurturing his rage, feeding it with memories of dead friends and burning villages, but rage required a clear enemy, and these women, sitting in a diner booth crying over hamburgers, were not the enemy he needed them to be. The waitress, whose name was Gloria, and whose brother had died at Iwo Jima, felt her own confusion mounting. She had expected to hate these women on sight. She had told herself she would spit in their food if she got the chance. But watching them now, seeing their obvious distress and disorientation, she found hatred harder to maintain than she had expected. When she brought the check, she left a small paper napkin with a note scrawled in pencil. "I hope you find peace." She didn't know why she wrote it. She would spend years wondering about that impulse. The tour continued through the afternoon, a carefully orchestrated journey through American achievement. They were taken to the Empire State Building, where they stood in the observation deck and looked out over the city spread beneath them like a promise or a threat. Anna gripped the railing and felt vertigo that had nothing to do with height. This was the nation that had destroyed hers. And it was so vast, so powerful, so incomprehensibly wealthy, that resistance had always been doomed. She thought of all the young men she had seen in uniform, all the boys from her village who had marched away to war believing in victory, and wanted to scream at the waste of it all. They were shown the Statue of Liberty from the ferry, that great symbol of freedom and welcome that had greeted millions of immigrants seeking new lives. The irony was not lost on any of them. Helene stood at the railing, the wind whipping her hair, and thought about all the propaganda she had believed, all the lies she had swallowed about American weakness and degeneracy. The statue rose before her, massive and unmovable, and she felt something crack inside her. Some last defensive wall crumbling to dust. By the time evening arrived, the women were exhausted beyond words, drained by the constant scrutiny and the emotional whiplash of the day. They were taken to a modest hotel, still under guard but given private rooms, another luxury that felt simultaneously generous and cruel. Greta stood in her room, looking at the clean sheets and running water and electric lights, and felt herself finally begin to break. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, but the tears wouldn't come. She had cried herself dry in the weeks after surrender, and now there was only this hollow, aching emptiness where certainty used to live. In the hotel lobby, Jack Morrison filed his story over the telephone, dictating to a typist back at the newspaper office. His editor wanted sensationalism, wanted outrage and conflict, but Jack found himself writing something else, something more complicated. "They are not monsters," he dictated. "They are not fanatics or devils or any of the things we have been taught to believe. They are women who have lost everything, who are being displayed like exhibits in a museum of consequences. To hate them is easy. To understand what they represent is harder." His editor would cut most of it, would reshape the story into something more palatable for readers who wanted their enemies to remain enemies. But Jack would keep the original draft, would remember writing it, would wonder years later if he had glimpsed something important in that moment. That night, while the women slept fitfully in their hotel rooms, New York debated their presence. In bars and living rooms, at dinner tables and street corners, Americans argued about what it meant. Senator Bradford gave another blistering speech, calling for the immediate end of the program. Dr. Whitmore defended it in radio interviews, insisting that showing mercy was not weakness but strength. The newspapers printed opinion pieces from both sides, their pages becoming battlegrounds for competing visions of American identity. Thomas Reed sat in his sister's apartment, trying to explain to her why he had followed enemy prisoners around the city all day. "I needed to see them," he said. "I needed to know if I could still hate them." His sister, a practical woman named Margaret, who had worked in a defense plant throughout the war, asked the obvious question, "And can you?" Thomas didn't answer, because he didn't know. The hatred was still there, but it had become more difficult to justify, like a coat that no longer fit properly. The second day began with a carefully planned encounter. Dr. Whitmore had arranged for the women to meet a group of American veterans at a neutral location, a community center in Midtown. The goal was dialogue, understanding, humanization. It was a terrible idea, and everyone involved knew it, but the experiment required it. Someone had to push the boundaries, had to test whether healing was possible so soon after the wounds. The veterans arrived first, a dozen men in their 20s and 30s, some missing limbs, all carrying visible and invisible scars. They sat in a circle of folding chairs, smoking cigarettes and radiating barely contained hostility. Thomas Reed was among them. Having been invited by an army chaplain who knew his story, Thomas had said yes without understanding why, driven by that same compulsion that had put him on the train. When the 5 German women entered the room, silence fell like a guillotine blade. The two groups regarded each other across an unbridgeable distance of 3 yards and 1,000,000 miles. Lieutenant Mitchell made brief introductions, her voice carefully neutral, then stepped back to let whatever was going to happen. A veteran named Joseph Russo spoke first, his words clipped and hard. My best friend died at Normandy. German machine gun cut him in half. He was 19 years old. You want to tell me why I should care about your feelings? Greta met his gaze without flinching. I cannot tell you that. I cannot make you care. I can only say that I also lost everyone. My brother, my father, my city. I can only say that I did not want this war. None of us wanted this war. Her voice carried no plea for sympathy, only a flat statement of fact. But you fought in it. Another veteran interjected, a man named Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China and who felt the weight of fighting for a country that still treated his family as foreigners. You put on the uniform. You served the Reich. Yes, Elizabeth said quietly. We did. Because we were afraid. Because we believed lies. Because we were young and stupid and thought we understood the world. We were wrong. About everything. She looked around the circle, meeting each man's eyes in turn. But being wrong does not undo the doing. We cannot unmake our choices. We can only live with them. Anna, who had remained silent, found her voice trembling as she spoke. I never hurt anyone. I was a clerk. I filed papers. I was supposed to help with supplies. The Americans came before I even understood what I was supposed to be doing. I am 20 years old. I have never kissed a boy. I have never been to a city before this. I don't know why I am here or what I am supposed to learn or what anyone wants from me. I just want to go home. But home is gone. Something shifted in the room. Not forgiveness exactly, and certainly not reconciliation, but perhaps the faintest recognition of shared humanity, of the grinding machinery of war that consumed individuals and cared nothing for their personal stories. Thomas Reed felt it especially strongly, this uncomfortable kinship with the enemy. He had killed German soldiers, probably men not much different from himself. Men who had also been young and scared, and caught in forces larger than themselves. The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, full of long silences and moments of renewed anger. But it happened. The veterans told stories of combat and loss. The women told stories of bombardment and surrender, and the apocalyptic final days when the Reich collapsed. No one apologized. No one asked for forgiveness. But they talked. And in talking, they became slightly more real to each other, slightly less easy to dismiss as abstractions. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, both groups were emotionally exhausted. A few of the veterans shook hands with the women, awkward and uncertain. Others walked out without acknowledgement. Thomas Reed stood face to face with Helene the nurse and found himself saying, I hope you get home safely. She nodded, her eyes wet, and replied, I hope you find peace. Neither knew if such things were possible, but the words had been spoken, and that seemed to matter. That evening, the program's organizers held a reception for select journalists and officials, a cocktail hour designed to put a positive spin on the day's events. Jack Morrison attended with his notebook and his cynicism, watching politicians congratulate themselves on their humanitarian vision while veterans groups picketed outside. But amid the self-congratulation, he noticed something genuine. Lieutenant Mitchell standing with Margaretha, showing her photographs of her own family, two women finding common ground in the universal language of missing home. Dr. Whitmore gave a speech about the importance of looking forward rather than back, about the need to build a lasting peace on the foundation of mutual understanding. Senator Bradford's office released a statement calling the entire program a propaganda stunt that dishonored American servicemen. The newspapers would print both positions on facing pages, letting readers choose which narrative to believe. But the women themselves, isolated in their hotel rooms, were undergoing a transformation that had nothing to do with anyone's political agenda. They were beginning to understand something that would take years to fully process. The world they had known was gone forever, and they would have to find a way to live in whatever came next. The propaganda about America had been lies. The propaganda about the Reich had been lies. Everything had been lies except the suffering, which was the only thing that turned out to be entirely real. Anna lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the veteran who had asked why he should care about her feelings. She realized she had no answer because the question was unanswerable. He shouldn't care. She had no claim on his sympathy or attention, but he had stayed for the entire meeting, had listened to their stories, and at the end had nodded to her, just once. A gesture of acknowledgement that she hadn't expected and didn't know how to repay. It was such a small thing, that nod. But it lodged in her chest like a seed, like the possibility that someday, somehow, there might be a way to live in a world that didn't require constant enmity. The final day of the visit came too quickly. The women were taken on one last tour, this time through a working neighborhood in Queens where ordinary Americans lived ordinary lives. They saw children playing in streets untouched by war. They saw grocery stores full of food, hardware stores selling tools, barbershops and beauty parlors, and all the mundane infrastructure of a functioning society. It was this more than anything that broke through their defenses. Not the monuments or skyscrapers, but the simple fact of normalcy. The evidence that life could be lived without constant fear and deprivation. They stopped at a small playground where a woman sat on a bench watching her children play. Lieutenant Mitchell, in a moment of unscripted humanity, approached the woman and asked if she minded if the visitors sat for a moment. The woman, whose name was Ruth Goldstein and whose husband was still serving in the Pacific, looked at the German women with complex emotions playing across her face. She was Jewish, and the weight of what that meant hung unspoken in the air. But she said, "It's a public bench. Everyone has a right to sit." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the children laugh and chase each other. Then Ruth spoke quietly, almost to herself. "My husband's family is from Poland. We haven't heard from them in 3 years. We know what that means." She turned to look at the women directly. "You were part of that. Maybe not you personally, but your country, your people, your leaders. That happened." Helene, her voice rough with unshed tears, replied, "Yes, it happened. We cannot undo it. We cannot make it right. We can only say we are sorry, and know that sorry is not enough. It will never be enough." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a handkerchief, which she handed to Helene. It was embroidered with small flowers, a pretty thing, personal and intimate. "I lost family," Ruth said, "but I won't lose my humanity too. That's what they tried to take from all of us. I won't let them have it." She stood to gather her children, then paused. "I hope you remember this. Remember that we could have been cruel, and we chose something else. Remember that when you go home, that small gesture, that single handkerchief exchanged between two women whose nations had been locked in mortal combat, would be photographed by Jack Morrison. The image would run in newspapers across the country, and it would become the defining symbol of the entire program. Not the monuments or the political speeches, but two ordinary women choosing humanity over hatred in a playground in Queens. The train ride back to the facility was quieter than the journey out. The women sat with their own thoughts, processing an experience that defied easy interpretation. They had seen America's power and prosperity, yes, but they had also seen something more complicated. A society wrestling with its own better and worse angels, a people trying to figure out what victory meant and what price they were willing to pay for peace. Jack Morrison rode with them again, but this time he didn't take notes. He simply sat and watched as 5 women who had been his country's enemies became, through some alchemy he couldn't quite name, simply women who had survived something terrible and were trying to understand what came next. His final article would be his most controversial, arguing that the program had succeeded not in proving American superiority, but in revealing American complexity, the messy reality of a nation that could be both generous and cruel, both idealistic and pragmatic, both forward-looking and vengeful. Back at the facility, Colonel Harrison waited to receive them. He had read the reports, seen the photographs, followed the public reaction. The program had been a publicity nightmare in many ways, generating more controversy than goodwill. But he had also noticed something in Lieutenant Mitchell's reports, something harder to quantify. The women had changed. They were no longer simply defeated enemies, but individuals beginning the long process of reckoning with what they had been part of and who they might become. In the weeks that followed, the 5 women would be returned to more conventional prisoner facilities, eventually repatriated to a Germany that barely existed anymore, a landscape of rubble and despair where the work of rebuilding would take generations. They would carry with them the memory of New York, the lights, the abundance, the hostility, the unexpected kindness, the veteran who nodded, the woman with the handkerchief, the Coca-Cola and hamburgers, the view from the Empire State Building. Anna would eventually make it back to Bavaria, would find her mother alive against all odds, would spend years working to rebuild their farm. She would never speak about the war except once, late in life, when her granddaughter asked. She would say only, "I saw what happened when hate became policy, and I saw what could happen when people chose something else." Both were real. Both were possible. That is what I learned. Greta would become a translator, using her English skills to help build bridges between the occupying forces and the German population. She would never forget the anger she felt at being displayed like a trophy, but she would also never forget that the Americans could have treated them far worse and chose not to. This contradiction would define her understanding of power and mercy for the rest of her life. Helene would return to nursing, would spend decades tending to the sick and wounded, would keep Ruth Goldstein's handkerchief in a drawer and look at it on days when despair threatened to overwhelm her. It would remind her that even in humanity's darkest hours, small gestures of grace remained possible, and that these small gestures might be the only things that made continued existence bearable. Elizabeth would become a teacher again, would spend 40 years educating German children about the war and its aftermath, would always tell them about the trip to New York not as a story of American propaganda, but as a story about the complicated nature of guilt and innocence, about how easy it is to become part of something terrible, and how hard it is to find your way back to humanity afterward. Margaret would never fully recover from the trauma of the war years. She would live quietly, would rarely speak about her experiences, would flinch at loud noises for the rest of her life. But she would also plant a garden, would grow tomatoes and beans and flowers, would find in the simple act of nurturing life some small redemption for having been, however peripherally, part of so much death. Thomas Reed would struggle for years with what he had witnessed during the war, and during those strange days when enemy prisoners walked the streets of his city. He would eventually become a teacher, like Elizabeth, would dedicate his life to making sure new generations understood the cost of hatred and the complexity of peace. He would never forget the blonde girl crying into her hamburger, would never be able to reconcile his rage at what had been done with his recognition of shared humanity. This tension would never resolve, and he would eventually conclude that perhaps it wasn't meant to, that moral complexity was the price of consciousness. The program itself would be quietly shelved after the New York visit, deemed too controversial to continue. But the photographs would remain, archived in libraries and museums, evidence of an extraordinary moment when a victorious nation attempted something unprecedented, showing mercy not from weakness but from strength, extending humanity to enemies while the wounds were still fresh. Whether this was noble or foolish, wise or naive, would be debated for generations. Years later, historians would study the episode as a curious footnote to the war's end, a strange social experiment that revealed as much about American anxieties and contradictions as it did about German prisoners. Some would praise it as an early example of the kind of thinking that would lead to the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe. Others would condemn it as a tone-deaf exercise in moral superiority that ignored the legitimate grief of families who had lost loved ones. But for the people who lived through it, who stood on both sides of that unbridgeable and yet somehow bridged divide, it was something more personal and less easily categorized. It was the day the enemy stopped being an abstraction and became individuals with names and stories and tears and hopes. It was the day Americans had to confront the uncomfortable truth that victory did not erase complexity, that defeating fascism did not automatically make every subsequent choice obvious or easy. In the end, perhaps that was the real lesson of those strange days in 1945 when 5 German women walked the streets of New York, that peace is harder than war, that mercy is more complicated than vengeance, and that the work of rebuilding civilization requires not grand gestures but 10,000 small choices to see humanity in unlikely places, to extend grace when rage would be easier, to believe that transformation is possible even for those who have been part of something monstrous. The lights of New York continued to burn, bright and defiant against the gathering dusk. The city that had welcomed millions seeking freedom had, for 3 days, also welcomed 5 women who represented everything America had fought against. They came as enemies and left as something harder to define, witnesses perhaps, or warnings, or simply human beings who had survived history's meat grinder and were trying to figure out what survival meant. The war would end officially a few months later. The lights would burn even brighter. The debates would continue, and somewhere in the ruins of Germany, 5 women would carry with them the memory of a city that had shown them both its strength and its capacity for mercy, and they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what that memory demanded of them, what it meant to have seen the face of the enemy and found it more complicated than any propaganda had prepared them to accept.